I never imagined that one day, the man I trusted the most would steal everything from me. My home, my family's legacy, even my dignity. I was betrayed not just as a wife, but as a daughter who had already lost both her parents. This is my story. A story of betrayal, of pain, of revenge, and of finding love again where I least expected it. I am Lily. I grew up on the smell of wet cement and the scratch of pencils on tracing paper. Real estate wasn't a business in our house, it was oxygen. My father kept blueprint tubes in the umbrella stand and ran his thumb across brick samples the way other men test the ripeness of fruit. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. He could convince a block of granite to glow just by promising it sunlight. After graduation, I slipped into his world without creases. I learned how to read a survey map like a spine. I learned the difference between a setback and a second chance. In the mornings, he'd stand at the model table with his reading glasses perched on his nose and say, "Look past what's there, Lil. See what could be." And I could. God, I could. My mother was the quiet correction in the margins. If my father was the force that made a plan stand upright, my mother was the gravity that kept it kind. She brought soup to site managers, stitched loose buttons on suits, sat at the edge of meetings to notice what men's eyes missed, an exhausted assistant, a vendor who needed a break, the way fatigue can chip away at integrity. With her, I learned that buildings were for people first. So when the man with the perfect cufflinks walked into our lobby, a cool breeze chasing his cologne, I was already standing in the foyer of a life I thought I understood. He was there on behalf of a client interested in our mixed-use waterfront parcel, one of those developments that seem inevitable once you see them on a model. Light spilling from glass, a ribbon of boardwalk, restaurant patios breathing out evening chatter. He introduced himself with a smile that promised he had already forgiven me for a mistake I hadn't made.
"Colin," he said.
Colin Mercer. He didn't look at the model first, he looked at me with a curiosity that felt like flattery because it didn't burn. It warmed. Even my father, typically immune to charm that didn't come with numbers attached, seemed to enjoy him. We started with coffee after the second meeting, a late lunch after the third, a drink after the site visit. He laughed easily and listened even better. He'd asked about my favorite buildings in the city and knew each one, not just the architect but the story behind the commission. He had a way of disarming me with confidence. And when he began to compliment my eye, my reading of soil reports, and my patience with permits, it didn't feel like seduction. It felt like respect. My father liked him. My mother said he had kind eyes. And I, only child in a house where expectations had always fit like a tailored coat, allowed myself the rare luxury of surrender. I stopped measuring. I started believing. We married the following spring. There are photographs of that day where my father is not looking at me but at Colin, smiling as if he's handing over a priceless heirloom he's certain will be cherished. In those pictures, my mother's hand rests lightly on my wrist, almost out of frame, as if she wanted to tether me to something I couldn't quite see. The first year was a montage of morning coffees, job sites dusting our shoes, and the warm relief of a partner who understood deadlines and documents, and the way a city's mood shifts with a zoning vote. We moved through rooms together like a single decision. And then, without warning, my father's heart simply failed him. One minute, he was walking down the hallway with his glasses in his hand. The next, the world had a hole where a room used to be. Grief arrived like bad weather and pitched its tent over us. The funeral felt surreal, a parade of men in dark suits telling me how much my father had meant to them, how they'd miss his steady voice on calls, how they'd never forget the way he could look at a vacant lot and see a playground. I stood there, accepting their words like envelopes, stacking them in a place inside me that had no shelves. That week, Colin held everything. He canceled meetings. He answered condolence emails. He made sure I slept. When I woke in the night, he was there, hand on my shoulder, the weight measured just right. He knew the right phrases. "We'll take it one day at a time. This wouldn't have been your fault even if you'd been there."
"He was proud of you, Lily."
He told me that. A few days later, he made a suggestion that seemed harmless at the time, that we move in with his mother for a while. "She's alone in that big house," he said. "It'll give you a change of scene." And He gestured vaguely, almost apologetically. It puts us closer to the downtown office. I can carry the business while you catch your breath. He can carry the business while I catch my breath. The words were a blanket in a chilly room. I was so tired of being strong that the offer felt like mercy. His mother's house was as immaculate as a museum, all polished mahogany and art that demanded agreement. She was gracious, smiling, efficient. The kind of woman who could glance at a room and tell which flower would make it look like itself. But she was also particular, and the house had rules spoken and unspoken. Shoes on the rack by the side door, towels folded in thirds, no keys left on the console, voices lowered after 10. I didn't mind. Structure felt like safety. In the mornings, Colin rose early and left for the office, sliding his tie into a perfect knot with a confidence that made something in my chest relax. When I tried to go with him, he'd take my hands and say, "Give it a week. You don't have to solve a thing today." The week became 2, then 3. He started sending me files to look at when you have the bandwidth. Code, perhaps, for when crying won't make you forget page 2. He hired additional staff, a new CFO with an old resume, a legal team with gleaming credentials. He moved meetings to the downtown office and told me it was temporary, just while the home office felt too full of my father's ghost. When I did go in, the receptionist greeted me with sympathy as if I were a visitor. The new CFO shook my hand too firmly, overcompensating for a lack of history. In the boardroom, a fresh silver pen lay at my place, heavy as a small weapon. Colin interpreted updates for me, translating jargon I already knew in case I'd forgotten how language worked when grief took away the nouns you needed most. "Just sign here," he'd say, soft and careful. "It's a proxy, so I can appear on your behalf at a zoning committee. Routine. Here, later. Power of attorney, limited, strictly transactional. Lets me deal with the bank without dragging you in for signatures. And here, after that, to consolidate the subsidiaries under one management umbrella. Efficiency, sweetheart. We're making your father's legacy resilient." I read, I asked questions, he answered. He was patient. He was never offended. He had numbers ready and models pulled up and emails from partners who liked the speed at which things were moving. When I hesitated, he'd wrap his hand around mine, and I'd remember the night I fell apart, and he steered me back to the surface. It felt ungrateful to doubt that same hand now. Meanwhile, my mother's health began to unspool. It was slow, the way a sweater catches on a nail and you don't notice until you feel the cold. A cough that lingered. An appointment, she said, was nothing.
A scan.
A word we couldn't speak without lowering our voices. The hospital's lighting always made her look transparently brave. I took my laptop to the oncology wing, folded contracts in my bag next to a granola bar and a book she wouldn't read. She kept telling me not to hover, kept asking whether my work was okay, as if the one thing she could control was her daughter's productivity. Colin drove me to the hospital every morning for a week and waited for me at the curb every night. "I've pushed everything to the legal team," he'd say. "Don't think about it. I'll be at the office if you need me." He would bring me coffee and kiss my forehead, and his mother would leave casseroles wrapped in foil with notes that said, "Eat, please." The calls from the office grew more abstract. Just a routine audit. Just a restructuring to optimize tax efficiency. Just a move to streamline vendor payments. Each just was a small bridge I crossed without looking down. There were tiny anomalies, like gnats that annoy rather than alarm. An email from a junior analyst addressing me as Ms. Mercer. A bank manager who insisted I make an appointment to access the strong room, then canceled because Mr. Mercer has updated the signatory list. A title insurance agent who asked if I wanted a copy of Mr. Mercer's final consent for my records. When I checked with Colin, embarrassed by the friction my grief seemed to create, his answers were consistent and compassionate. "They're trying to shield you, Lil," he'd explain. "People are overcorrecting because they don't want to bother you. Let me handle it." His handling was immaculate. Time behaved strangely. Elastic when I needed speed. Brittle when I needed mercy. One evening, while my mother slept shallowly and television blue flickered against her white blanket, I opened a folder Colin had sent and found a flowchart of subsidiaries so tidy it felt moral. Boxes and arrows, arrows and boxes. My father's life rearranged into a diagram that made sense from a distance. Closer, though, I saw new names. Entities with initials. Trusts with pleasant, bland titles. Colin walked me through them later at the dining table, the runner perfectly aligned, the overhead light flattening the room into order. Think of this as insulation, he said. All the value is preserved, but it's protected from market shocks, from suits, from, God forbid, another crisis. You own the key assets through the holding structures. We ensure continuity. He smiled. I smiled back. The casserole cooled untouched. The day my mother died, the nurse folded the sheet with ceremonial efficiency, and I felt like a building imploding from inside. No blast, no smoke, just floors collapsing in neat, inevitable sequence. Colin arrived late, apologetic, breathless from the stairs. He held me while I cried into a suit lapel that smelled like rain. The following week, I signed more. Some documents were about my mother's estate, small, neat affairs that fit into manila envelopes and felt like betraying her handwriting. Others were about my father's company, bigger, heavier, their paper thick enough to have opinions. The new lawyer, one of Colin's hires, had a voice like beige paint. He explained things to me in precise sentences, slipping in phrases like irrevocable and absolute assignment, the way a tailor slips extra lining into a hem. If I frowned, he restated the sentence until it sounded like something inevitable and kind. Here, Colin said one more time, tapping 2 final pages as if they were postcards. These close the loop. You'll sleep better when it's done. We were in the downtown office. Late light pooled on the conference table like lukewarm tea. I could see my reflection in the window. Me. In a black dress that had seen too many formal goodbyes. Me. With my hair pulled back by necessity. Me. Signing what I was told were the last of the transitional instruments. The pen scratched politely. Outside, the storm thinned to a mist. The city exhaled. Afterward, Colin packed the folder with careful hands. He kissed me. I tasted peppermint and a faint metallic edge. We're okay, he said. It's all one story now. On the ride home, his mother called to ask if we wanted chicken or fish. When I said I had no appetite, she said she'd make broth. The house waited for us with its tidy lamps glowing in disciplined pools. I wanted to sink into a chair and turn off my brain like a light. I wanted to believe that paperwork was a kind of ritual that could secure the past in place. Sometime after midnight, when the house was quiet and even the refrigerator stopped its small, domestic hum, I got out of bed and padded to the study at the end of the hall. Moonlight pushed through the blinds in slices. The leather folder was on the desk, where Colin had left it. I told myself I was only going to put it away more neatly. I opened it. The closing documents were all there, signed and initialed, my name looping obediently in the margins. I had never been a careless reader, but grief had fogged my lenses. Still, sentences stood out, sharp as needles in wool. Assignment of membership interests. Transfer of beneficial ownership. Appointment of sole managing member. It took me a minute to realize the pattern woven by those calm phrases, to follow the arrows the way my father taught me to. The chart in my head began to redraw itself. The tidy boxes shifted, and the lines between them hardened into something like bars. In one document, the trust described as family stabilizing, named a single trustee. In another, the temporary power mutated into a permanent authority for purposes of continuity. A merger of 2 subsidiaries I recognized as vital funneled value upward into an entity I didn't recognize at all, one I'd never seen on any of the legacy charts. The beneficiary of that entity, written in letters that were suddenly too large to ignore, was not me. Behind me, the door frame held a shadow. "Can't sleep?" Colin asked, his voice soft, carrying a smile in it. I shut the folder. My throat felt full of glass. I was just filing. He crossed the room, easy, unconcerned, a man walking through his own kitchen. He closed his hand over the folder and slid it toward himself, casual as a tide. "You've done enough for today," he murmured, pressing a kiss into my hair. Tomorrow, no work. We'll drive out to the lake. Clear our heads. I nodded because my body didn't know what else to do. He turned off the lamp, and for a moment, everything vanished into the clean dark. In that exact instant, I could hear my father's voice in my memory, the way he'd say, "Look past what's there.
See what could be."
I had been seeing what I wanted to see. I had mistaken the shine of new glass for sunlight. Back in bed, I stared at the ceiling and counted the seconds between the house's small night noises. In the hallway, a floorboard sighed. Somewhere, a pipe clicked. The world went on pretending to be ordinary. There are betrayals that detonate, leaving craters and sirens and neighbors at their windows. And there are betrayals that move like fog, quiet, patient, absolute. You come to your senses and realize the streetlights are pale coins, and the shape beside you is not a tree but a stranger. By the time dawn made a faint promise at the blinds, a single, inescapable truth had taken shape. Over the last 18 months, while I was learning to live without a father and then without a mother, while I trusted the man who held me through hospital corridors and graveside hymns, the roof of my life had been lifted off, beam by beam, and carried away in daylight.
I didn't yet know how far the damage went.
I didn't know which keys would stop working, which doors would open to rooms that no longer belonged to me. I only knew one thing with the certainty of a foundation poured deep and true. This was not the end of the story. It was the blueprint for war. The night began with laughter, but it ended with ruin. Colin had been changing for months. His late nights became later, his excuses thinner, his temper sharper. The man who once kissed my forehead before leaving for the office now splashed cologne at midnight and wore suits not for business, but for the theater of excess. At first, I told myself it was grief, that he, too, was drowning in the hollow absence of my parents, that he sought distraction in neon lights and pounding music because silence terrified him. But grief doesn't swagger through the front door at 4 in the morning with lipstick smudged on a collar. Grief doesn't shove away a wife's reaching hand or sneer at her questions. What lived inside Colin now was something else, an appetite without a leash. I still remember the night it broke open. I was in the sitting room, curtains drawn against the darkness, a lamp humming softly beside me. I had dozed off waiting, half hoping he wouldn't come at all. Then the door banged open with a violence that rattled the frame. Colin stumbled in, laughter bursting from him in jagged pieces. But he wasn't alone. A girl clung to his arm, her eyes glassy with drink, her hair wild from the wind. She couldn't have been more than 23. Her name spilled from Colin's mouth between slurred jokes. Ellen. The two of them swayed together, intoxicated not only with liquor, but with the shamelessness of their display. My stomach twisted, as if the floor had tilted. "Colin," I whispered, rising to my feet. "What is this? Who?" But my words cut off when he laughed in my face. "Don't play Saint Lily. You've had everything handed to you. Tonight, I'll have what I want." Ellen giggled, draping herself against him. "Don't be jealous, sweetheart," she slurred, her perfume thick as smoke. "He's mine tonight." I reached for Colin's arm, desperation flooding me. "Colin, stop this. Please. Not here. Not in our home." He jerked free, eyes sharp with contempt. "Our home? Lily, this is my house now. Don't you dare tell me what to do." The slap came so sudden I didn't see it. Heat exploded across my cheek. Ellen shrieked with laughter, emboldened by his violence, and in her drunken frenzy, she too shoved me hard against the wall. My breath caught in my chest. "Pathetic," Colin spat, dragging Ellen toward the staircase. "Find a corner and cry yourself to sleep. We're done talking tonight." I stood frozen as they stumbled up the stairs, their laughter echoing obscenely, their steps pounding into the privacy of what had once been my bedroom. My sanctuary turned into a stage for betrayal. When the door slammed shut above, silence rushed in, heavy, suffocating, unholy. It was as if the roof of my life had been ripped away and the storm poured in without resistance. For the next days, the house became a battlefield where I was the sole prisoner. Colin no longer cared for appearances. Ellen's belongings appeared in drawers, her scent tangled in the air, her mocking laughter spilling across rooms where my mother's voice had once been soft. Every plea I made, every tear I shed, met the same wall of cruelty. "You've got nothing, Lily," Colin sneered one morning at breakfast, Ellen draped lazily beside him. "No family, no claim. You're a ghost in a house that isn't yours." My hands trembled on the coffee cup. "This was my father's," I whispered. He snapped, his voice like a blade. "Your father's name is dust now. Everything is under my signature. And you signed it away." Ellen smirked, sipping from my mother's china. She's still clinging to the fantasy that she matters. The world around me tilted again. Even the servants, those who once greeted me with respect, now looked past me. Their loyalties shifted to the man holding the purse strings. I was alone. Truly, unbearably alone. The final blow came swiftly. It was a Sunday morning. I had barely slept, my eyes swollen from nights of silent sobbing. Colin entered the sitting room with Ellen at his side, both dressed carelessly, the smell of last night's liquor still hanging on them. "It's time you left," Colin said flatly. "This house isn't yours. Neither is the business. You'll pack what you can and get out. Today." I shook my head, disbelief choking me. "You can't." "Colin, where will I go? This is my home. My parents." "Your parents are gone," Ellen interrupted with venomous sweetness. "And so are you. Colin doesn't want you anymore. Simple as that." I dropped to my knees before him, dignity dissolving. "Please," I begged, clutching his hand. "Don't throw me away like this. Don't dishonor everything my father trusted you with." He yanked free, his face twisted with disgust. "Your father trusted me because he was a fool, just like you." The words struck harder than the slap had. He pointed toward the door. "Go, or I'll have security drag you out like the stray you are." I staggered upstairs, tears blinding me, my chest heaving with humiliation. If I was to be exiled, I would not leave empty-handed. In the bedroom that no longer smelled of me, I dragged out a small suitcase, an old briefcase I had once used for my university files. My hands moved frantically, shoving in clothes, shoes, whatever fabric felt familiar enough to anchor me. My sobs came in waves, but beneath them a thin current of resolve began to stir. Then I remembered. Behind the row of dresses in the wardrobe, in a small velvet pouch, lay the jewelry my mother had given me before the wedding. Pieces that predated Colin. Pieces that carried the weight of my lineage, my identity. He had never noticed them. Perhaps he thought me too naive to keep anything beyond his reach. With trembling fingers, I retrieved the pouch and slipped it deep into the briefcase. Diamonds, pearls, a gold chain once warmed by my mother's skin. All of it hidden like buried treasure in the wreckage of my life. When I emerged from the room, the briefcase heavy in my grip, Colin and Ellen were waiting at the foot of the stairs. Ellen's eyes gleamed with cruelty. "Going so soon?" she mocked. I lifted my chin despite the tears streaking my face. "At least allow me my dignity. You've taken everything else." Colin waved a dismissive hand. "Get out." The front door loomed before me like the gate of exile. I stepped across the threshold, the cold air slapping my face, my suitcase dragging behind like a wounded limb. No parents to shield me, no siblings to defend me, no husband to honor me. The world had narrowed to one truth. I had been stripped bare, cast into the street with nothing but a briefcase and the echo of my parents' ghosts. But as the door slammed shut behind me, sealing me out forever, another truth flickered beneath my grief. He believed he had taken everything. He believed I was finished. But in that velvet pouch, in the last fragments of my past, lived the seeds of my future. And as I walked away from the house that was no longer mine, a vow began to crystallize, not in words, not yet, but in the iron taste of survival. This was not the end. It was the moment the fire began to burn. The streetlights blurred through my tears as I dragged my briefcase into the night, but fate had not abandoned me entirely. When I thought myself utterly alone, a memory flickered, Sophia. My classmate, my friend, the one who had always believed in the strength I couldn't see in myself. With trembling fingers, I dialed her number. My voice broke as soon as she answered. Within 10 minutes, headlights swept the curb and there she was, leaning out of the window of her car, worry etched across her face. "Lily," she gasped, pulling me into her arms the moment I slid into the seat. What happened? The dam inside me burst. I told her everything. The late nights, the betrayal, the cruelty, the moment Ellen walked into my home like a conqueror and I was thrown out like a beggar. Every word tasted of ash. By the time I finished, my voice was raw. Sophia's grip tightened on the steering wheel, her jaw set with fury. "You're not alone. Not while I'm here. First, we'll get you a room at the girls' hostel. Safe, private, away from that monster." Then she glanced at me, a strange light in her eyes. "Then we'll see Henry." "Henry?" I asked, exhausted. "Our classmate? Psychology department Henry?" "Yes," she nodded. "But he's not the same Henry anymore. After his degree, he studied under a great master of mind sciences. Telepathy, Lily. Real telepathy. He teaches it now, and he helps people, especially those who've been wronged. If anyone can turn the tide for you, it's him." A shiver ran through me. It sounded impossible, like a story told in whispers. Yet something in Sophia's certainty gave me hope where despair had taken root. I clung to it as we drove through the silent city. The next morning, Sophia led me into Henry's office. It was lined with shelves of thick books and filled with an unusual stillness, as though the air itself listened. Henry rose to greet us, his eyes calm, piercing in a way that made me feel both exposed and safe. "Lily," he said gently after hearing my story, "what they've taken from you can be reclaimed, but you must be brave. Telepathy is not magic, it's discipline, focus, and the strength to bend a mind until it reveals its weakness. Colin is corrupt, but Ellen is easier prey. We begin with her." His words ignited a spark inside me. For the first time since my parents' deaths, I felt the promise of justice. Together, Henry and I approached Ellen with calculated charm. It wasn't difficult. She was vain, hungry for validation, and too blinded by her new wealth to suspect betrayal. Henry guided me, teaching me subtle techniques, mirroring her tone, feeding her illusions, planting suggestions so delicate she believed they were her own thoughts. His telepathic influence wrapped around her like invisible threads. Within weeks, Ellen and I were on familiar terms. She began confiding in me, unaware of the silent force directing her mind. Slowly, her attachment to Colin weakened. She grew restless, suspicious, easily provoked. And then, with a masterful push from Henry, she turned her papers over, transferring the house, the property, all in my name once more. Colin never suspected until it was done. The confrontation between them was volcanic. I wasn't there, but Henry later told me how Ellen screamed that she had been used, how Colin raged and struck walls, how their love rotted into hatred overnight. Colin was sharper, more guarded, harder to penetrate. But greed, Henry said, is the crack in every fortress. Henry disguised himself as a potential investor, weaving tales of international ventures and returns so vast they glittered like diamonds in Colin's imagination. At the same time, he drew closer as a confidant, someone Colin believed he had outsmarted. What Colin never realized was that Henry's influence was slipping past his defenses, planting seeds of suggestion, guiding his hand every time he signed a new document. With every stroke of his pen, the empire he had stolen began to crumble back into my possession. I watched from the sidelines as account after account, deed after deed, shifted back under my name. My heart pounded with every victory. And then, one morning, Colin woke to discover that he had nothing. His fortune evaporated, his business titles gone, his house no longer his. The empire he had gloated over was once again mine. His rage was terrible. He stormed into offices, shouted at lawyers, demanded answers. But every trail ended in cold legality. Every signature was his own. He had no one to blame but himself. The day he realized it fully, I saw him on the street from a distance, disheveled, broken, muttering curses to the wind. The man who once threw me out like a shadow was now a shadow himself. Justice, at last, had returned. In the quiet after the storm, Henry remained by my side. His strength had become my anchor, his wisdom my compass. He never asked for thanks, never sought reward, but I saw the way his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking. One evening, as we stood in the restored office that had once belonged to my father, Henry spoke. "Lily," he said softly, "you've reclaimed what was yours. You've proven stronger than betrayal, stronger than grief. But I would be lying if I said this was only about helping a friend. Somewhere along the way, I found myself caring for you. Deeply." My heart stilled. His words were steady, not the honeyed flattery of Colin, but the quiet truth of a man who had already proven himself.
He took my hand.
"I don't ask for an answer now. Only this. Consider a future not built on loss, but on choice. On love that honors, not exploits." Tears filled my eyes, but for the first time in years, they were not born of sorrow. "Henry," I whispered, "you've given me back more than my home. You've given me back myself." And when I accepted his proposal weeks later, it was not out of desperation, but out of hope. Together we stood not as broken survivors, but as partners who had rewritten destiny itself. The house glowed with life again, not the sterile control of Colin's reign, but warmth, laughter, and quiet resilience. My parents' portraits remained on the walls, their eyes watchful, proud. Colin and Ellen vanished into obscurity, swallowed by the same greed and cruelty they once wielded. Their names became cautionary tales whispered in hushed tones, reminders that betrayal always carries its own curse. And I, Lily, once stripped of everything, stood whole again. Beside me, Henry's hand was steady, a promise carved not in paper, but in the unshakable language of trust. From ashes, I had risen. From shadows, I had reclaimed the light. And this time, I vowed, no one would ever steal it from me again.